Hello everyone, my name is Avril Drummond. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm Professor of Healthcare Research at the University of Nottingham in the UK, and I'm a stroke rehabilitation researcher. I also have the immense privilege of being chair of the European Life After Stroke Seminar Series 2021. We are really excited to be bringing you this series of events. We have over 9 million stroke survivors in Europe, and even in the midst of the pandemic, it's important to remember that stroke is still really important. This webinar series focuses on life after stroke and really key issues for this community. We want to build this community more by including researchers, healthcare professionals, stroke survivors, family and carers, so that we have a real community. We want to stimulate debate, we want to improve care, and we want to pave the way for our first conference next year on the 11th of March. Please put that date in your diary now. But the first thing I want to do is to thank the stroke survivors who have helped us and informed us in developing this webinar series. And I would like to introduce some of them to you now, who would like to tell you their story.
Sou Diana Von Ramos e venho de Portugal. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao primeiro Fórum Europeu da Vida pós-AVC, séries de webinars. Eu sofri um AVC há 10 anos, quando tinha 34 anos, em 2011. Hello, I'm Diana Von Ramos and I come from Portugal. Welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum series of webinars. I had a stroke when I was 34 years old, in 2011, 10 years ago. After my stroke, I had to adapt my life by learning how to stand up by myself, how to, for instance, to cook by myself. Now, I only have one hand to cook, but I can do things with patience and never giving up. It's the most important thing. Never give up.
Grüezi, ich bin Jörg Schwitter. Bonjour, je m'appelle Jörg Schwitter. Buongiorno, mi chiamo Jörg Schwitter. Hello, my name is Jörg Schwitter and I am from Switzerland. Welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum webinar series. I had a stroke when I was 44 years old, so 12 years ago. My biggest challenge after the stroke was that I had to reinvent myself as a university professor, in particular how I was going to teach the students in light of my aphasia.
Hei sann, mitt navn er Grete Lunde og jeg er fra Norge. Velkommen til European Life After Stroke Forum, en serie med seminarer. Jeg hadde mitt hjerneslag som 22-åring for 27 år siden. Hello, my name is Grete Lunde from Norway and welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum series of webinars. I had a stroke when I was 22 years old, 27 years ago. After my stroke, I had to adapt my life by pushing the restart button and start on my new history.
Pozdrav svima, moje ime je Hrvoje Jurla iz Zagreba, Hrvatske i dobrodošli u europsku seriju webinara zvan Europski život nakon moždanog udara forum. Imao sam moždani udar kad sam imao 39 godina, što je sad prošlo 6 godina. Hello, my name is Hrvoje Jelina from Zagreb, Croatia, and welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum series of webinars. I had a stroke when I was 39, which was 6 years ago. The biggest challenge that I faced after my stroke was the uncertainty that I faced every day, the uncertainty of what laid ahead.
Hi, my name is Arlene Wilkie, and on behalf of the Stroke Alliance for Europe, I'd like to thank Diana, Greta, Herv and Jörg for sharing their experiences of living with the effects of stroke. And now I'd like to introduce you to some of the members of the European Life After Stroke Forum Scientific Committee who have helped us shape this webinar series.
Hello, my name is Carina Persson and welcome. Welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum webinar series. I have worked at the Department of Occupational Therapy and Physical Therapy at Sahlgrenska University Hospital for the last 30 years. Life after stroke is not just about surviving, but about living a dignified life. I'm excited to hear how stroke services outside Sweden have dealt with their missions during this pandemic. So, what effect did the healthcare readjustment due to COVID-19 had on individuals who have had a stroke? And what are the similarities and the differences between countries? And what are the lessons learned? This web event will be attended by people who themselves have suffered a stroke, their relatives, patient communities, and professionals from healthcare and research. All are fiery souls with a desire to make a difference. Altogether, the potential is large. So, welcome all, participate, and make a difference.
Welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum webinar series. I'm Professor of Rehabilitation Research at St George's University of London, Kingston University. The pandemic really has been a quality improvement journey in stroke care, and maybe now is the time for us to consider what we amplify and what we keep in a post-COVID, post-vaccine world. There have been so many examples of how stroke services have had to pivot and change, some with really positive impacts, such as the growth of online neurorehabilitation. Come and hear about some of these examples in our webinar series. The critical time for learning about life after stroke is now.
Olá, meu nome é Nuno Ferreira e bem-vindos à série de webinars do European Life After Stroke Forum. Hi, my name is Nuno Ferreira and welcome to the European Life After Stroke Forum webinar series. I'm an Associate Professor of Clinical and Health Psychology at the University of Nicosia in Cyprus. Now, in a time when so many advances in health are dependent on the synergy from multiple stakeholders and creative partnerships, the Life After Stroke webinar series promises to deliver a truly 360-degree view of the best in current practices in stroke from the perspective of all involved. I really hope you enjoy the European Life After Stroke Forum webinar series. It will be one of those events that you'll want to say, I was there.
Good morning. Good morning to you all, and a very warm and sincere welcome to you wherever you're joining us from. I know I'm actually in Nottingham in the UK at the moment, but I know that there are people around the world who are watching this probably still in their pajamas, who have got up very early or are still in the middle of the night. So thank you all. My name is Avril Drummond. I'm an occupational therapist and I'm a professor of healthcare research in Nottingham in the UK. I also have the honour of being chair of the scientific committee for this Life After Stroke webinar series and for our big conference, which will be in Barcelona on the 11th of March next year. So please start saving for that because we'd like to see you all there. Before I introduce them this morning, I would just like to thank a number of people. I would really like to thank our sponsors who have been really generous, and because of them, we have been able to bring this webinar to you free. I'd like to thank our partner organisations. Of course, I'd like to thank the Stroke Alliance for Europe, and I would like to thank the members of my committee who have worked really very hard to bring this series to you. So just some minor housekeeping rules. On the right of your screen, you will see that there's a live discussion button. Please do engage. Please post your chat. Please ask us questions and please participate in the polls. At the end of the meeting today, we will send you a very short feedback, but please tell us what you think. Tell us if we've got it right. Tell us if you think we should be doing things differently. We really want to hear from you.
And we are absolutely aware that we have a wide range of people. We have stroke survivors, their family members, healthcare professionals, researchers, and policymakers. And we really need to build this community because life after stroke is important. Please post tweets about the meeting today and about the series. And the handle is #LifeAfterStroke, all one word. So I genuinely hope that you enjoy this morning, and I hope that you enjoy us and join us for other seminars in the series. I really want to emphasize that we are very focused on the stroke survivor, and we really want to work with our stroke community to improve services for people after their stroke. I'm now going to introduce you to the main act for this morning, and I'm going to hand you over to the two chairs. And the two chairs that we have for this morning's sessions are Katarina Sugerhagen, who is a professor and chair in rehabilitation medicine at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and also Jörg Schwitter, who is a very eminent professor of linguistics from Lausanne University, but who also had a severe stroke 12 years ago. And my two chairs are going to keep the speakers in order, and we'll be holding the question and answer session at the end of today. Thank you very much and enjoy the session this morning.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Avril, for introducing us. Jörg and I are very honored and thrilled to be sharing this important session today. Life after stroke, priorities, challenges, and ways forward. We will be hearing from eminent speakers from different parts across Europe who will share with us their experience and knowledge on life after stroke care and supporting the COVID-19 world from perspectives of their country. We will hear examples from Sweden, from the UK, and this will be followed by a short video from Alexia Conturi about her life after stroke, followed by, later on by perspectives from Italy and Ireland. At the end of the presentations, we will take questions from the floor and all of the sessions that we've heard this morning. So the first speaker we have is that Professor Bo Norrving, Professor of Neurology at Lund University in Sweden. And Bo Norrving, he was one of the founders, or one of the co-founders of the Swedish quality register Riksstroke. And Bo will share with us the challenges of providing life after stroke from a Swedish perspective. The Riksstroke is the first quality national register in the world. So please, Bo, the floor is yours.
Katarina and everybody, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event here. I'm very pleased to take part of this, and this is very close to my heart. So I will speak to you about challenges in supporting life after stroke experience from Sweden. So my next slide is my disclosures, and the next slide, this is a background for my presentation. As Katarina said, we have the Swedish Stroke Registry, or Riksstroke, and this was founded in 1994, and we have a very good coverage of all patients with stroke in Sweden, about 90%. Very early in Riksstroke's history, we also included a follow-up after 3 months, and about 10 years later, we also included a follow-up after 12 months. So we will have possibility here to use a register, not only to see what's happening in the acute phase, but also what is the situation in life after stroke. So quite early after we started the Riksstroke registry, we also started to do surveys on carers to get a more complete picture. So the early surveys that were quite scary what the situation we found in people after stroke. But what I will focus on in this talk are 2 recent dissertation theses from my co-workers. So my next slide. These are the 2 theses that were a few years ago. Now, and the first one is from Teresa Ullberg, this you see from the left, and this is based on the follow-up at 1 year after stroke. is about 65,000 patients that are entered in this study on what is happening at 1 year after stroke. And you see Teresa on the left on the photograph. And next to Teresa, you see Stefan Senfeldt, who had his dissertation last year. And this is the thesis on stroke in the long term, also including data on not only patients, but also carers. On the slide, you also see Jesper Pettersson and myself. We are the proud supervisors of these wonderful PhD students who are now getting very, very senior in their research career. So I can have the next slide, please. First, these are from Teresa's thesis, 1 year after stroke, based on about 65,000 patients. And what she saw in this, you have summarized this here. One finding was that the functional decline after stroke is quite common at 1 year. It was about 1 patient out of 6 that had a functional decline, and in particular elderly women. The second main finding was that there was a high proportion that reported unmet needs, and also that they didn't have a chance to meet a doctor at 3 months after the stroke. And what she found was that this was linked to high age, severe stroke, previous stroke, those most vulnerable, those who were most in the need to have a follow-up were those who had the most of unmet needs. And she also found when she studied different items that there was a clustering. If you have one problem, you tend also to have several others. And this shows that it's not enough just to look at single items in the follow-up after stroke. You need to see the whole picture, need to follow up all main domains after stroke, not only secondary prevention, not only single items, but you need to capture them all. And as you will hear, this had a very profound influence on the implementation of follow-up services in Sweden. So the next slide now. This is the other thesis from Stefan Senfeldt, and we had the opportunity in Riksstroke in 2016 to do a longer follow-up study. So we were discussing about how many years should we use? Should we use 3 years or 5 years? So we made a compromise. We take a half-annual cohort followed for 5 years, and we take another half-annual cohort followed for 3 years. In total, these are data from about 23,000 patients. One of the studies from Stefan is this one on long-term survival and function after stroke. And the next slide. And what we found that even now in the situation of stroke unit and thrombolytic therapy, we found that the prognosis after a stroke is still very serious. You can focus on the right part. On this slide here, ischemic stroke and it's a cerebral stroke. And you can see with increasing time after the stroke, that is an increasing number who have died, but there is also a very, very high level of dependency. There is quite small fraction of the patients who have survived and are not disabled after 5 years. So this is a very serious message. I think that despite all the advances that we have had in stroke care, is still a very severe disease. Stroke is a life event. Life after stroke is really something which is very important and that we should have very much respect for. The next slide. We also had the opportunity to look into the carers' situation, and this is a publication which was published a few years ago on this topic. So the next slide. Here we had the unique opportunity to send out a survey, not only to patients, but also to the carers. So we had the pairs, we can compare what is the status of the patient, what is the status of the carer, and we can put these data together. So overall, we had more than 5,000 such pairs of patient and carer with a high response rate. And you can see that there were different levels of functional status in the patients. About half of the patients were independent, about 1/3 were partially dependent, and about 10% were completely dependent. And these were all patients living at home and with a carer. So the next slide. So go back one slide. Yeah, so this is one of the findings here from this, that you can see that the very high proportion of patients or the carers were poor physiological, psychological well-being at 5 years after stroke. We can show that this differed between different levels of the patient's functioning. If you were living with a completely dependent patient, you were really a very bad situation with a poor psychological well-being. So there is no standard after stroke. It's very individual. It's no standard life after stroke. Next slide. So my next slide, please. Yeah. So what was the conclusion of this? Well, we need to have a structured follow-up after stroke. This was clearly recognized. And when we were developing the Swedish national guidelines, and I did this together with Katarina Stibrand Sunnerhagen and other co-workers in 2019, we took this to our heart. It was an item to have a structured follow-up after stroke. When we did the priority examination on this, it scored very, very high on the priority scale. For all patients with stroke, to use a post-stroke checklist, but we were faced with a problem how to organize this, how to implement this in clinical practice. So the next slide. So this has now been studied in Malmö by Teresa Ullberg and co-workers in a study of a consecutive cohort of stroke patients in the neighbor city, Malmö next to Lund, the STRUCT-FU study. So this was set up a nurse-led multidisciplinary stroke follow-up model using the post-stroke checklist to map all the stroke interventions that were followed here, and then also to validate the different items in the post-stroke checklist to other scales. So the next slide. This is a modified post-stroke checklist that we used, and Katarina and myself, we were part of the original group 8 years ago in conjunction with the World Stroke Organization, who established the post-stroke checklist and put that to work. And here you see the different items in the post-stroke checklist. I do not read them to you, but you see that these are all the main problems that you need to communicate and examine and assess when you're doing a follow-up after stroke. So next slide. So here are now a few slides on the results of this study. This is a first really explorative study on how well does the post-stroke checklist work in clinical practice, what are the main problems. And first you can see that for most of the items, there is a high proportion of patients that had a stroke-related health problem picked up by the post-stroke checklist. Next slide. And here you can see the intervention that this led to. The patients met a nurse who then communicated in a group meeting, team meeting with a multidisciplinary team, and they, in the next step, led to interventions for the patients. You can see that for many of the domains, there were high proportion of the patients that had a specific intervention because of what was found out in the post-stroke checklist. So the next item, next slide. And here you can see this by profession. Some of these were by doctors, but very many also were by nurses and rehabilitation interventions. So it really was a full team that was included into this work. And next slide. The final one in this series, intervention by type. And here you can see that the most common type of intervention was information and tailored advice, but it was also referral to rehabilitation and referral to primary care, and then more specialized items. So the next slide. Here, if we see a summary, what was the finding of how the post-stroke checklist worked at 3 months follow-up after stroke? We found that almost all of the patients had stroke-related health problems. Very many of the patients had many problems. 86% needed stroke team interventions for the post-stroke problems. There were only 3 who had other stroke-related problems than the 13 specified in the checklist. And it means that if you use a post-stroke checklist, it works extremely well. It picks up the main problems after stroke. So the next slide. So where are we now in Sweden? This was highly prioritized in the Swedish National Guidelines for Stroke Care 2019, is now in implementation phase, and in the development of the Swedish Stroke Register, we are now also including more items from the post-stroke checklist in the follow-up surveys that we are conducting. Next slide. We are also very happy that there is now good scientific evidence of the use of this structured follow-up model. It's been published a stroke card study from Austria. It shows that if you use this, you have a better prognosis in very many aspects after stroke. So we have now a good scientific base also of this model. So can I have the next slide? So I think this is a very important principle here that we try to establish. We have had one of the glories of evidence-based medicine. This has been the introduction of organized acute stroke care, stroke units, which now is one of the essential elements of stroke care globally. What we want now is to extend this, not only to have an organized acute stroke care in the acute phase, but also to have an organized follow-up after stroke for all patients after stroke. So is this a final answer? Can you solve anything with this follow-up? Can you solve everything with the post-stroke checklist? Next slide. No, you cannot, of course, because we know it's so much more in life after stroke. And I'm very pleased now that this is part of the action plan for stroke in Europe, which I had the privilege to share, and which was published a few years ago, and which is now in implementation phase. John Barrick was a representative here from the stroke support organizations, and he first said that we should have an element of life after stroke in each of the domains. And we said that no, let's single that out as a separate domain. Life after stroke is so important. So I'm very, very pleased that this is now the case, that this is a separate item. I'm very pleased now that this is a separate topic of this session today. My next slide. So I just mentioned a few personal experiences also working as a professional, but quite early in my career, I also had the possibility to work closely with stroke support organization. And I can tell you, I learned so much from having the patient experience told to me. So I think you can have this expression of the second disease. The first disease, this is a stroke. These are the medical aspects of the stroke, of the disease. The second disease, this is the existential aspects. Very often the patient have these questions. What will my life look like? How will it affect my family situation, my family role? Will I make it financially? Will I become disabled and demented? And I think these aspects have not been very well taken care of by the health services. It's been one of the most profound experiences that I have, and I think this really needs to be improved. And for many patients, the second disease is just as much as an aspect of the stroke by itself, by a pure medical aspects. I think it needs to be much more recognized. So next slide. I'm very pleased with the collaboration now between the European Stroke Organization and SAFE on the European Stroke Action Plan. The voice from the patients, the voice from the professionals working together in this. I think this is a wonderful collaboration. My next slide. I think life after stroke is one of medicine and society's most neglected areas. It's time to change this now. We have models for this. This will be very challenging, but I'm sure that we can do this together. So on my final slides, I want to say thank you to my co-workers, Teresa Ullberg, Stefan Sandfeldt, to Jesper Petersson. Also want to recognize the close collaboration I've had with Katarina Stibland Sunderhagen, with the post-stroke checklist, with the Swedish stroke guidelines, and with the Rikstroke also. So thank you so much for listening to me. It's been a pleasure to present to you today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Bo. This was a wonderful talk. We will have to change, and the next speaker is going to be Juliette Bouvier. She's an OBE, and me, who is not from the UK, I have to look it up. It means that she has received Order of the British Empire for her work on stroke. She is the Chief Executive of the Stroke Association in the UK, and she will talk about how COVID-19 has impacted people affected by the stroke in the UK and what it means for the stroke policy and support services. So Juliette, please come on.
Thank you, Katarina, and wonderful talk, Bo. So hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining this important webinar. My name is Juliette Bouvier. I'm Chief Executive of the Stroke Association in the UK. The Stroke Association is the UK's leading stroke charity. We deliver services, we fund research, and importantly, we advocate for changes in policy. And our vision is for there to be fewer strokes and for people affected by stroke to get the help they need to live the very best life that they can. And I have no disclosures this morning. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to cover in the next 15 minutes is a brief summary of a major piece of market research that we did with stroke survivors and their carers in 2018. And then I want to share with you our insights during 2020 when the coronavirus pandemic struck. And then finally, I will draw out the implications for both stroke services and policy and our recommendations. Next slide, please. So in 2018, we did a major piece of market research to capture the lived experience of stroke survivors and their carers. We had over 11,000 responses from people in the UK, and we believe it's the largest one-off single survey of people affected by stroke worldwide. We had 9,200 responses to a postal survey and 1,800 responses to an online and telephone survey. And this piece of market research was very robust in terms of its methodology. It had a large sample size and it echoed many of the findings that Bo has just explained to us. We saw a huge range of unmet needs in both stroke survivors and carers. But there were 4 things that particularly came out from the research. The first is that it's often the invisible effects of stroke that are most challenging to deal with. So things like fatigue, post-stroke depression, emotionalism, and cognitive deficit were frequently reported as having a significant negative impact on stroke survivors' lives. Carers unfortunately bear a significant and ongoing burden, and their negative feelings were around things like exhaustion, sadness, feeling trapped, and we mapped how those feelings change over time, and unfortunately for carers, those negative feelings get worse over time rather than better. Stroke survivors and their carers both told us there's still a lot to do to improve stroke support and rehabilitation. We continue to hear that too many stroke survivors feel abandoned on leaving hospital, that they lack essential information, that the support is either not provided or not for long enough, and there's a noticeable lack of emotional and peer support. And younger survivors of working age are particularly hard hit by the ramifications of their stroke, with many experiencing financial difficulties and concerns about being unable to return to work. Next slide, please. So, as we all know, last February, March, we became aware of COVID-19. And in March 2020 in the UK, as it was in line with many other European countries, we saw a dramatic reduction in hospital admissions, and that also translated into a dramatic reduction in admissions to stroke units. So we undertook a small survey to understand what was it that was preventing people from calling 999? Why were people fearful of going to hospital? A couple of months later, in May, we surveyed all of our research award holders. And again, they told us that the pandemic was having a big impact on research, with their research studies either paused or difficult to carry on because of the inability to see people face to face, or in fact needing to be redeployed onto COVID studies. And then in June 2020, we did another big survey, this time with nearly 2,000 people affected by stroke, to build a picture of how the pandemic was impacting on their lives and their stroke recoveries. We had over 79% of stroke survivors responding to the survey, 21% were carers, 110 people had had their stroke in the last year, and 69 their stroke since March 2020. Next slide, please. Now, all of those pieces of insight and research told us that almost all aspects of stroke treatment, care and research have been impacted by the pandemic, from pre-hospital care through to acute and emergency care, through to rehabilitation and life after stroke. Next slide, please. So I particularly want to highlight 4 findings that came out from our June 2020 survey. And the first relates to problems accessing rehabilitation and support. And there were 2 main challenges. One was that around half of stroke survivors had their therapy appointments or home care visits cancelled or postponed. They just did not have those appointments. The second challenge was that 56% did not feel safe to attend those appointments. There was significant fear around either going to hospital or having strangers come into your own home because of the risk of contamination and spread of COVID-19. 39% of stroke survivors who had a stroke in 2020 said that they just had not received enough rehabilitation therapy, and 34% of those who had a stroke prior to the pandemic said that the support that they'd received was worse than it had been before the pandemic. And the quotes on the right-hand side of this slide are just a very small sample of the qualitative feedback that we received. And I think, unfortunately, these themes will be familiar to you. So people saying things like, I felt like I'd fallen out of the healthcare system. My mum having dysphasia and having limited speech therapy, and that impacting on her recovery and well-being. And one person, which was mirrored by stories from other stroke survivors, just saying they hadn't had any physiotherapy at all and really not sure when that was going to commence. So we know the difference that stroke rehabilitation can make to people's recoveries. So it's really worrying that people are not being able to access it. Next slide, please. The second area that we investigated was around telehealth. Now, 45% of the stroke survivors who responded to our survey said that they had had appointments online or over the phone, but obviously 55% did not, which meant that they were just not accessing that support. And it was interesting, the findings in terms of people's satisfaction with telehealth. Now, we were quite surprised. 61% of people said actually they were quite satisfied with therapy being delivered by phone or online. They liked it because it was convenient, it was flexible, it was easier to access. They didn't have to travel to hospital or other community outlets to access the support. But conversely, a significant minority, and that's 30%, expressed dissatisfaction with telehealth. And that was particularly true for people with aphasia or severe speech and communication difficulties, and people with cognitive challenges for whom accessing support via the phone or online was really challenging or almost impossible. And I think these quotes do illustrate that problem. The top quote is from somebody who said, I have telephone anxiety due to my stroke. When I'm stressed or when I'm tired, I find it particularly difficult to communicate, and telephone consultations just add serious anxiety to my life. But conversely, somebody else saying, actually, I had my physiotherapy sessions via FaceTime and actually it's going okay. But that individual, interestingly, knew their therapist before. They had met face-to-face before. So it helped that they had a pre-existing relationship. So I think we can take from this that the pandemic has absolutely had a disruptive impact on therapy. Generally, the findings are pretty bleak, but there is a glimmer of positivity for some around online and phone rehabilitation provision in the future. Next slide, please. Now, I want to pick up a theme that Bo touched on about stroke survivors and carers' mental health. Mental health needs were the least well met need before the pandemic, and there is absolutely no doubt that COVID-19 has made that significantly worse. We know that having a stroke compounded with COVID-19 and the lockdown restrictions have really taken their toll on stroke survivors' mental health. So 7 in 10 stroke survivors have told us that they felt more anxious and depressed lately, with 68%, a very significant majority, saying they feel more worried about their health, and 69% saying they feel more worried about what the future holds. And I have to say that some of the quotes that we received in our survey were really heartbreaking. They were really distressing. So people saying, I'm going days without talking to or seeing anyone, and I'm finding myself crying for just no reason. I've been feeling really very depressed. It's been extremely lonely not seeing anyone. It's isolating. And I'm worried that it might cause another stroke. And then the last quote saying, I'm scared of having another stroke. I'm 100% more scared of having another stroke than catching coronavirus. And I think that says it all. We cannot underestimate how scary and life-changing a very sudden brain attack is. And we've got so much to do to make sure that policymakers and health service commissioners really do prioritise the provision of mental health support for stroke survivors and also their carers. Next slide, please. So carers, again, we know that carers were being adversely affected pre-pandemic, and the pandemic has had a stark mental health impact on informal carers. 77% of carers and family members report having provided more care during lockdown. Those normal community services are just not operating as they would be normally. And some stroke survivors and carers, as I said earlier, are worried about having formal carers coming in to their own home when they're worried about the risk of contamination. 56% of carers told us they just feel overwhelmed and unable to cope. And 72% of carers looking after somebody who's had a stroke feel overwhelmed and unable to cope. That is nearly 3/4 of stroke carers saying that they're feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope. And it's really concerning. And the quotes just do bring it to life, with stroke carers reporting that they're feeling trapped at home. You know, he seems to be happy enough, but I just want to run away. I'm feeling more isolated from family and friends than I was before. I've had no respite from my caring responsibilities. And, you know, I'm juggling so many different roles. I'm needing to be a physiotherapist. I'm needing to be a psychologist, a friend, a communicator, a carer, a motivator, and much more. There is no doubt that our stroke carers are almost at breaking point. Next slide, please. So what have we done with these findings? Well, in September last year, we published a very significant report called Stroke Recoveries at Risk. It is available on the Stroke Association website, and I will give you the web link at the end of the presentation. We made a number of recommendations to governments across all 4 nations of the UK. Our first recommendation was to make sure that all the innovations and adaptations that have been made during the pandemic are properly evaluated. Stroke services, the stroke clinical and research communities have responded magnificently. And there are some innovations and some aspects of care that I have no doubt we will want to embed on an ongoing basis, but we really must evaluate those carefully before we make decisions about what the best models of care are going forwards. Bo mentioned the importance of follow-up. The UK National Stroke Clinical Guideline recommends that stroke survivors are followed up at 6 weeks, 6 months, 12 months, and annually thereafter. And yet we know from our UK stroke audit that only just over 1/3 of stroke survivors get a follow-up review at 6 months. This just is not good enough. We know the extent of the unmet needs that stroke survivors have into the long term, and we also know about their clinical frailty and vulnerability. We absolutely must put pressure on systems to ensure that structured follow-up happens regularly. We're also calling for governments and health and care systems to prioritise mental health provision for stroke survivors and carers. At the moment, emotional and psychological support is seen as a desirable add-on. We are advocating that emotional and psychological support is prioritised and that it is seen as a core part of stroke service provision. Having a stroke is a sudden and very life-changing event. It is not surprising that stroke survivors and their carers are psychologically traumatised, and we need to address that in the provision of services. And finally, we must make sure that stroke rehabilitation is delivered in line with national clinical guidelines. We know we have good evidence about stroke rehabilitation. We know that dose and intensity matter, and we know that stroke rehabilitation must be provided for as long as it is of measurable benefit. And so we are urging policymakers to act on that recommendation. Next slide, please. So what has the Stroke Association done with these findings? Well, alongside our clinical colleagues, we have adapted and developed our own services. With immediate effect from March 2020, all of our face-to-face services moved online. And I have to pay credit to our stroke coordinators and our stroke clubs and groups for doing such a good job maintaining support by phone and online. We've created new pages on our website all about stroke and coronavirus, including some great tips on how to keep healthy and well at home, and also some lovely exercise videos specifically designed for stroke survivors to keep them physically active at home. And we've created 2 brand new services, which we're committed to delivering in the long term. The first is Here For You, which is a volunteer-led phone service. So a volunteer, often a stroke survivor, will be matched with another stroke survivor, and they will speak to each other by phone each week for 12 weeks to chat, to offer companionship, and to address social isolation. And that service is very, very popular and has been well evaluated. The second service is Stroke Association Connect, which we are running in partnership with the NHS. And in geographies where the Stroke Association does not have a local service, we are following up people who are newly discharged from hospital. We're giving them a phone call to find out how they are, to talk them through how they can rebuild their lives after stroke, and to signpost them into available support services. And then we follow up with a second phone call after that. And again, the 3 and 6 month evaluations of that service are incredibly positive. It helps people to come to terms and adjust to a new norm, but also takes pressure off our clinical colleagues. Secondly, we've used the report to put pressure on system decision makers locally and nationally. We emailed all UK politicians a copy of the report. We have had a follow-up meeting with the Department for Health and Social Care. We now have the Act Fast campaign running again since Monday this week, thanks to our recommendations. And we have shared our findings with Scottish Parliament and also with the Welsh Assembly. And we were delighted that we received significant media coverage at the time of the publication of the report. But our key message in the report was that stroke still matters. Despite COVID-19, stroke still strikes every 5 minutes, and it must not be overlooked. Next slide, please. So just finally, if you would like to find out more, here are the web links for the 2 reports that I have mentioned. The Stroke Recoveries at Risk report, published in September last year, and the Lived Experience of Stroke report, published in 2019. So thank you all very much. I'm delighted to talk to you all, and I do hope you're enjoying this webinar. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Juliet. This was interesting and a presentation to see and to listen to. We have a 5-minute interval before the next intervention. I would ask you all to stand up, raise your arms. I'm a rehab person, so move around a bit, and you will also have the time to share a video of Alexia Conturi sharing her experience of living with stroke. There's also a poll for you to complete in the poll tab in the live discussion section. So move around and listen to Alexia. Thank you very much.
Γεια σας, ονομάζομαι Αλεξία, είμαι από την Κύπρο και καλωσορίσατε στη σειρά διαδικτυακών σεμιναρίων του Ευρωπαϊκού Φόρουμ μετά τη ζωή μετά το εγκεφαλικό επεισόδιο. Είχα εγκεφαλικό επεισόδιο όταν ήμουν 27 ετών πριν από 6 χρόνια. Hello, my name is Alexia. I am from Cyprus. Welcome to the European Forum Life After Stroke of SAFE. I had a stroke when I was 27. This was 6 years ago. My biggest impact on me and my family after the stroke was confusion, shock, grief, guilty, and anger because they don't know how to handle the stroke. I have no idea what happened to me, and I couldn't speak at all for 1 month. Now I can move. I cannot move my right side, and I was scared. After my stroke, I adapted my new life by accepting my new me. It's not easy to accept and deal with aphasia and hemiplegia. Find activities that bring you joy and get moving. I love to work Pilates, yoga, or boxing. My biggest challenge after stroke was to speak again. I understood everything, doctors and family, but to speak was very difficult. After After 6 years of my stroke, I can speak and I found a job. So back to work give me the satisfaction and improve the quality of life. The biggest support I received from friends and family that helped me to adapt the life after stroke. They helped me to develop a good sense of my weaknesses and strength. I received support during rehabilitation from doctor, physio, language and speech and language therapist, occupational therapist, and psychology. After my stroke had also impact on my life, on my family and the people around me. This gives me the motive to improve me and the quality of life. I can walk by myself like a turtle, no stick, just need the turtle legs. I can speak, write, I can talk, write and read, I need just more time. I taking part in stroke support groups with Cyprus Stroke Association, and I'm the proud ambassador of my country. Thank you and have a nice day.
Welcome back, everyone. And thank you very, very much, Alexia, for sharing your experiences. This was a wonderful video showing how important life after stroke is for us. You are really a great role model to us all. I hope everyone on this webinar found our presentations this morning useful and interesting. And don't forget, if you have any question at all for our speakers today, please submit your questions in the Q&A facility. We will then pick them up at the end of the session and try to answer them. I would now like to introduce to you our next speaker, Caterina Pisternini. Caterina is the Director of Scientific Rehabilitation at Istituto Salvatore Maggiore in Genova. She will now share insights from Italy, showcasing new ways of working during the COVID pandemic. Caterina, please.
Thank you very much for this kind presentation. Thank you very much for your kind invitation, and good morning or good afternoon to all the attenders. I would to show you the Italian experience in rehabilitation field during the COVID pandemic that start from 1 year in March 2020 and that continue unfortunately in this period because we have many cases in every day in Italy. Next slide, please. We can see that the COVID pandemic represents a unique challenge for the field of rehabilitation of patients with neurological disability and in particular from stroke for two main reasons. One is that individuals with acute stroke with disability continue to require ongoing management and specific intervention during this period. And the other reason is that individuals with chronic disability because stroke happened many years ago, who are at other risk for functional and medical decline, require and the care and receive less than optimal preventative and restorative service. Then rehabilitation setting and other clinical setting and rehabilitation activity had to be modified to meet their need. Next. Given the difficulty for offering appropriate rehabilitation treatment, we need to transform our hospital setting also in rehabilitation unit. Then system intervention have been performed. System intervention concerned the definition of dedicated pathway of care for patients with negative infection, that this is not infected, from patients from suspected positive or positive COVID cases. Another very important aspect was to perform a structural indication. For example, we had limited admission to hospital, only 2 was that were essential, and all other access has been closed. Other indication was for patients who suffer from recent onset from stroke, where the rehabilitation unit were located in the same hospital of acute care. These patients could access to rehabilitation treatment only if they had negative nasal or throat swabs, so not infected. From other patients who came from other acute hospital outside rehabilitation unit, the patients with the stroke were admitted only with negative swabs, and they were posted in isolation for 14 days before to admitted in rehabilitation setting with other negative patients. For patients outside the hospital, so for the service of day hospital or out hospital service, the rehabilitation activity were closed. Another next slide, please. This point allowed some criticism because, as you know, patients with stroke required intensive rehabilitation treatment, multi-professional treatment. And this has been a very important criticism because we had to choose a priority of hospital admission for patients with often unstable vital function and poor recovery potential. And another aspect concerned the performing of each task, because the maintenance of safety of staff and the patients allowed conflicting tasks during the performance of treatment. Next slide. Another aspect very important was what we done to help patients and the family. We tried to find ways to keep patients in their normal routine as much as possible, to set up online tool for staying in touch virtually with their friends, family member, and other people, and also to find out a patient's doctor, therapist, and other care team members were changing their appointment. Next slide, please. One strategy to support the patients in remote treatment was to use a smart solution. Smart solution currently guarantee a continuous and coherent relationship from the hospital setting and a domestic environment in a supervised way. This solution allows personalized consultation and treatment via telephone or live internet connection or via pre-recorded session. This smart solution requires a general indication, that is to perform the rehabilitation treatment following the diagnosis and the clinical assessment of patients, and the specific requirements that are to adapt the exercise to eventual recovery of patients. Next slide. This is an example, new example, how we can to perform with smart solution rehabilitation treatment at home. In this slide, you can see that the patients at home can perform the exercise displayed on the TV by box that contain an internet card, and webcam record the exercise performed by therapists. through an external cloud, the exercise and the results are transmitted to professional who is in hospital, and the professional can control in this way the performance of patients. Next slide. An alternative possibility for rehabilitation activity is to use the telemedicine, teleconsulting for patients at home. This is helpful currently when we want to increase treatment compliance of patients, to enhance frequency and intensity of rehabilitation protocols, and to increase adherence and motivation of patients. Next slide, please. This is one of the solutions of telerehabilitation. We have two possibilities, online and offline. Online means that the patients could perform the exercise displayed on the laptop, and the professional in the hospital control the exercise performed by patient and can modulate the exercise with a direct contact. Offline is another way, that is to prescribe to patients a list of exercise that the patients could perform autonomously at home. After a specific number of a list of exercise that could be cognitive or motor or both, the exercise are controlled after the list of prescription in the hospital by therapists or by doctors. Next slide, please. This our Italian experience is that COVID pandemic forced us to rebuild and implement our rehabilitation activity. This is a unique challenge for offering new possibility of rehabilitation treatment. And this is helpful also because it is opportune to rebuild our rehabilitation treatment, for example, in a remote way, when another emergent situation could happen, or also if the individual situation forced that to prescribe a new strategy for rehabilitation treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katarina, for this really interesting and enlightening presentation. I would now like to introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. Liam Healy. Liam is a consultant stroke physician and clinical lead at Cork University Hospital. Liam will now share his experiences of providing care during COVID. Liam, please.
Thank you very much, Jörg, and good morning, everyone. Good morning from dry but cold Cork City on the south coast of Ireland. Delighted to be with you this morning. I am going to talk to you a little bit about how our country, how our stroke services coped during the last year that we've all suffered through, with particular reference to our stroke early supported discharge team, who played a huge part in adapting and modifying their own practice so that they could meet the rather unique needs that were thrust upon them during this time. Next slide, please. I'm going to start first with a story. Michael is a 66-year-old man, and Michael is normally fit and well with no medical conditions. Michael lives in Carrigtwohill. Carrigtwohill is about 10 miles to the east of Cork City. And almost to the week last year, Michael began to feel unwell. He developed a dry cough, developed a temperature, and became increasingly breathless, and tried to stay at home, managing himself for the few days as best he could, until he became increasingly sick and was brought into hospital. and was brought into the emergency department here in Cork University Hospital on the 20th of March last year. Next slide, please. You can see from Michael's chest x-ray that he has already developed an ARDS type picture. And if his chest x-ray didn't reassure you that he's sick, his vital signs certainly should. His oxygen saturations are 66% in room air. He's working hard with a respiratory rate of 40 breaths per minute. And he's pyrexial with a temperature of 40. Next slide, please. Michael is intubated in the emergency department. He is unsurprisingly diagnosed with COVID-19 and found to be in multi-organ failure, with arrangements made for him to be moved to intensive care. Next slide, please. Michael's case was reasonably typical at the time. He presented in March, so with the benefit of hindsight and in retrospect, we can see that the initial first wave that we had here in March in Ireland was actually the smallest of the 3 waves that we subsequently had. We had a reasonably quiet summer, albeit under still severe restrictions, before a second wave hit us in October. And then the worst was yet to come. And around Christmas time in this year, we had a third wave, which really dwarfed the first 2. Next slide, please. And the third wave really was the worst of it for us. There was a time when we had the highest rate of COVID infection in the world, and having done reasonably well for the preceding 9 months, an already stretched stroke service and an already stretched hospital service came under severe pressure. Next, please. Before we talk about how the COVID has affected our hospitals and our stroke services, I think it's important to reflect on how COVID has affected all of our lives, here in Ireland at least. So as I mentioned, we've had the longest lockdown of any country in Europe. There were windows of opportunity during the summer when people could attend various different events, like going to restaurants and going to pubs. This picture, you'll see a man has a clock on his table because at the time attendance indoors was limited to about, I think it was 1 hour and 45 minutes at the time before you had to leave. Next slide. Attendance at sporting events and participation in sporting events was severely curtailed, requiring some ingenuity on the part of locals to continue to watch our local games, which are such an intrinsic part of Irish life. Next slide, please. Perhaps the saddest part of how this COVID has affected our daily lives is in funerals and how we managed the passing of loved ones. Irish culture and tradition is very good at kind of saying goodbye to people, and the reassuring kind of pageantry of funerals was sadly deprived from people who'd lost their lives, leading to even more lonely kind of scenes than we would normally see. Next slide, please. So if that was how life was affected during COVID here in Ireland, unsurprisingly, just like most of you throughout Europe, the hospitals came under severe pressure as well. Particularly, as I said, during that third wave, which we're just coming out of about now, all of our hospitals throughout the country were under severe strain and pressure, and the cracks and fissures that already existed in a hospital infrastructure became much more magnified. Next slide, please. As Juliette has said, our initial concern was that with case reports coming from China, you might remember, we were worried that we'd be deluged with kind of strokes, as there was news that there was high evidence of strokes occurring with COVID. And in actual fact, the exact reverse was what we saw as well during wave 1. So a survey was put out from the National Stroke Programme just after the first wave. And unsurprisingly, as most of you will have had similar experiences, 93% of Irish hospitals reported a significant reduction in stroke presentations during that first wave of the pandemic. Next. Our stroke units themselves were severely affected. So most of you, I'm sure, will have the same experience that I do, where the stroke clinical nurse specialist plays a hugely important role in knitting together the various different strands of all that's good about our stroke unit care, from medical to therapy to nursing. And 1 in every 3 stroke units here in Ireland had their stroke clinical nurse specialist redeployed as COVID overwhelmed, and the knock-on effect on the stroke units here was difficult to measure. Next slide again, please. 3 of every 4 stroke units here in Ireland reported a reduction in health and social care professional staffing. So all of the work that is so vital to the operation of a stroke unit, from physiotherapy to occupational therapy, dietitians and speech and language therapy, either through illness or being redeployed into other various different roles in the hospital, it meant that the normal therapy care, which is so important to our stroke patients, on our stroke units became severely reduced. Next slide, please. Perhaps most importantly, we had difficulty discharging people. So people who were normally going to be discharged home, albeit requiring some element of social care or some community supports, they were often absent. People who required off-site rehabilitation for more severe strokes were often deficient as well. One of our local off-site rehabilitation units here in Cork had a severe COVID wave itself, and it was shut for most of last year. And equally, people with the most severe strokes who required continuing long-term care, because long-term care facilities here in Ireland, as I'm sure again throughout Europe, bore the brunt of a lot of this. Trying to get people out of hospital into continuing care proved hugely problematic as well. Next slide, please. The Irish National Stroke Programme, under the direction of Professor Renan Collins, did issue some directives here to the Health Service Executive in Ireland, to various hospitals and hospital managers, just outlining again that stroke is an acute illness, and whilst some elements of hospital care could be delayed or postponed during the pandemic, stroke really wasn't one of them. Next slide again, please. And apart from the effects on acute care, one of the main thrusts of the National Stroke Programme was to make sure that our egress options were still preserved, most especially our early supported discharge team, who play a huge role in trying to coordinate the care of people who are after their acute episode and need to move on from hospital. Next slide, please. This was a collaboration that was done between both here in Ireland and colleagues in the UK, where a joint statement was issued kind of around, I think it was the end of March last year, again just re-emphasising to everyone, all of us within hospitals, hospital managers and everyone, of the importance of early supported discharge team and community stroke rehabilitation, and how they really weren't anything that we could ideally try and reduce or cut back on, despite the multitude of pressures that were coming from elsewhere. Next. This is what stroke early supported discharge teams looks like in Ireland. This is data from the last fully complete national report from 2019. It's moved on a little since then. We have about 24 hospitals in Ireland who receive acute stroke patients, and only 5 of them for the moment have early supported discharge teams. That has increased a little since this, and there's probably another 3 added, taking us to 8. And the hospital I work in there is a hospital in the middle, so 10% of our patients are discharged home with the benefit of early supported discharge team, a target that we're looking to improve on significantly and get it up north of 20% when services are properly developed. Next slide, please. This is what an early supported discharge team looks like in Ireland. So it's a combination of physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, augmented by a general purpose therapy assistant, medical social worker, and a clinical nurse specialist. Next slide, please. I'm very fortunate to work with these people. This is our early supported discharge team here in Cork. And this is Marie Condon, our physiotherapist, Louise O'Regan, our occupational therapist, and Anne Barrett and Lucy Pope, who alternate between speech and language services. Next slide, please. And they played a huge role in coordinating not just our local response here, but even the national response. Marie particularly liaising with Professor Collins and trying to coordinate a national response to this, and with UK colleagues to make sure that we were doing what other countries were doing as well. Next slide again, please. There have been few kind of teams or services during times COVID who had to react or were managed to adapt as quickly as the early supported discharge teams, not just here in Cork, but their colleagues throughout Ireland. So our first case of COVID in Ireland was 29th of February. First community acquired case was on the 1st of March. Our national parade, the St. Patrick's Day parade, was cancelled on the 6th of March. And our domiciliary visits were cancelled on the 9th of March. So our early supported discharge service here in Ireland is predominantly domiciliary, whereby a team of therapists follow a patient home and into their home and provide whatever rehab is necessary there. And this was cancelled on the 9th of March. Within 10 days, our early supported discharge team had rewritten their ways of working and their standard operating procedures and their consent mechanisms. And on the 20th of March, in a very rapid period of time, were able to conduct their first tele-rehab session, where they sought to move the vital functions of rehab into an online forum. On the 22nd of March, our early supported discharge team here in Cork liaised with colleagues nationally to see if they could all share their problems and ideas and the solutions that they were having together. So a national forum and a national database was quickly established to share best practice. And then on the 30th of March, that was shared with colleagues across the water again, just to make sure that we were all singing from the one hymn sheet, really, I suppose. Next slide, please. And this is what we tried to do. So again, as I said, it was domiciliary-based visits prior to this, but it was decided that a much more blended and nuanced and flexible approach was necessary to continue post-stroke rehab during these very straitened times. And that was decided to be a combination of outpatient attendance, as was available, domiciliary visits, if and when they were available. That was very much dependent on the prevalence of COVID at the time, coupled with virtual rehabilitation, as we've seen from the previous speaker in Italy as well. Next slide, please. There's a huge amount of issues to tackle here, and these were tackled remarkably quickly. And some of the barriers and red tape that always kind of hinders progress in hospitals had to be quickly removed. The issues that were relevant here really were the technical setup, how to set up a technical rehab service in the space of a week, how to make sure that the environment was kind of appropriate for that, both from the therapy side and for patients, making sure that the people had the appropriate documentation, that consent was kind of done, that there was risk assessments done, that we weren't causing any harm to patients, and that we were content that this was going to make a meaningful difference. And things that would normally take months in these instances happened in a few days. Next slide, please. The technical issues really were some of the huge issues that we faced initially, and these are some of the small nuanced things that really, when combined, make the difference between success and failure. This is Marie showing the benefit of contrast. So imagine someone trying to look at the image on the left at home on a laptop versus the image on the right. It's much clearer to see our physiotherapist Marie and the various different exercises that she can outline to someone at home. Next. Similarly, it was vital, obviously, at all times to make sure that the therapist could be both seen and heard by the patient, and importantly that the patient equally could be seen and heard by the therapist. And these sound like trivial matters, but actually they're the key to its success or failure. Next slide, please. Feedback was hugely important in these things. So it's one thing for a therapist to be instructing kind of patients as to what it is that they should be doing, but without that feedback loop and being able to guide and advise patients as to what they're doing and offer simple corrections, it would have been considerably less effective. So a simple task of angling laptops to make sure that what a patient was doing could be seen and appreciated by a therapist was hugely important. Next slide, please. And again, this is just Marie again demonstrating kind of some strength and stability exercises to patients who are at home online. Next slide, please. So we'll come back to Michael. So when we last left Michael, he was in the emergency department being intubated and tended to by the critical care team. And Michael obviously was admitted to the intensive care unit. Next slide, please. Michael was very unwell, and this is a scene that became all too familiar on our TV screens kind of over the course of the last 12 months. Michael spent 4 weeks in intensive care, on dialysis, multi-organ failure, being prone with difficulties ventilating him. And then about 4 weeks into his intensive care, as if things weren't serious enough, the stroke team were called to see him. Next slide, please. As Michael was being awoken from his medically induced coma, the intensive care doctors reported that he was not speaking and was not moving his right side. And we feared the worst. During his critical care episode, Michael had developed atrial fibrillation amongst all the myriad of medical problems that he'd had. And sure enough, an MRI scan confirmed our clinical suspicions that Michael had suffered a stroke. Next slide, please. So Michael's clinical syndrome at the time when he moved from intensive care was of a left total anterior circulatory infarct. He was severely dysphasic. He was requiring a hoist transfer to move him from bed to chair. He required NG feeding and assistance with all activities of daily living. We got some reassurance from his MRI scan that he had not lost a whole wedge of his left hemisphere, but he actually had multi-embolic kind of infarcts throughout all territories. And we reasoned that the fact that he was critically unwell was making his stroke look especially severe. It was during this time that Michael really got intensive on-ward physiotherapy from all the domains that you'd be familiar with: physiotherapy, occupational therapy, dietitians, and speech and language therapy. And slowly but surely, Michael started to recover. So much so that arrangements was moved for him to be discharged home with the early supported discharge team. Next slide, please. This is Louise and Anne, who kind of were doing various different online exercises as Michael tried to regain his life. In terms, this is just simple language exercises, trying to teach him again the money management and all the things that were important to his job. Next slide, please. Michael drives for a living, and it was hugely important that he was able to do all the necessary tasks that are so important in driving, from executive function to visual spatial to route planning and everything else. Next slide, please. And this is the man himself working with Marie, the physiotherapist, who was again using all innovative means that she possibly could in an effort to strengthen Michael and improve his balance and function as he continued to rehabilitate. Next slide, please. We did a survey of our patients who would pass through the service to see if they found it useful. And a bit like Juliet's study, some of it was hugely encouraging. About 80% of our people either agreed or strongly agreed that tele-rehab improves access to healthcare, when access was one of the huge issues at that time. Next slide. Again, just about 80% of people found that tele-rehab provides for their healthcare needs. This is people who had a stroke and left home, so clearly healthcare needs were very high. And then the last graph on this series, next slide. A little bit more circumspect here, as people said that tele-rehab was the same as in-person rehab, so there's a more even spread on this, you can see, where some people kind of agree and strongly agree, but some people certainly felt that it was not as good as in-person attendance. Next slide. We know that early supported discharge team is a very strong evidence base to it, and I think the onus on us now is to make sure that blended models of care, if they do persist in going forward, that oscillate between domiciliary visits, tele-rehab and inpatient attendance, have the same evidence base if we are going to amend our practices long term. We need to make sure that there's an evidence base to make sure that this is robust. Next slide. This is Michael again. So Michael, if you met him today, has no discernible stroke deficits. He's back working. He's back living a full independent life. And in his own words, he's one of the lucky ones. It was the skill and expertise of the renal teams here, the critical care team, the respiratory team, that helped keep Michael alive for the 4 weeks that he was very unwell in hospital. But it is the multidisciplinary rehabilitation that he received both on the ward and through the early supported discharge service that gave Michael his life back, and that allowed him to get back to the person that he was. Last slide. I just want to say thank you very much to Michael for allowing us to tell his story. A huge thanks to all the multidisciplinary teams throughout Ireland and in fact Europe who've amended their work practices so well and so quickly. And lastly, thank you very much for your time.
So thank you, Liam, very much for an interesting presentation that outlined the great work that you're doing in Ireland. And I would like to thank all the speakers. All the presentations that have been given during this talk will be available by SAFE after this event. It's now time for questions, and we have a short period for questions now, about 10-15 minutes. And I would say that we would start, we've had a number of questions in the chat, and I will start with a question for Bo. And that question to me was very interesting. So I have the privilege to choose. And that question is, do you expect, do you see any differences between the ischemic and the hemorrhagic strokes in the register that you're keeping?
What we see is a difference in the prognosis, because it's a much higher risk that you will not survive after a hemorrhagic stroke. But apart from that, if you are a survivor from either ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke, it's very much a similar problems that we face.
Mm-hmm. I also have another question. I was wondering for the whole team, the whole, all of them. I mean, do you think that, I mean, why is stroke not funded enough? Not funded enough in healthcare or not funded enough in research? Why do you think this is unsexy? Juliet?
Katarina, I'm happy to give my personal perspectives. I worked for 16 years in one of the UK's largest cancer charities. And as you will know, cancer has a very high profile. And I think that's for several reasons. One is there are just a lot of cancer charities that advocate and put pressure on policymakers, but also a lot of cancer survivors do shout loud and proud about their cancer experience and their cancer stories. And I think they've been a real movement for change. I think what's different in stroke is, one, I think the stroke support organisations are much smaller and don't have the same power as the cancer charities. And secondly, our stroke survivors and carers are struggling with everyday living. A lot of them just do not have the time or the energy to be powerful advocates for change. So I think what we need to try and do is mobilise as many stroke survivors as we can, because the people who can create the most compelling stories and reasons for change are the people themselves with lived experience. And I think that's one thing we need to do, but also the kind of collaborations that Bo mentioned, you know, the Stroke Alliance for Europe, you know, the kind of way we all speak with one voice on common issues, I think is also required. But I think we just have to keep persevering. Stroke will get its day at some point, I'm sure of it.
I have one question also for Caterina Pisserani. And what is your main learning from the changes that you have done in Italy after stroke and the COVID pandemic?
In this period in Italy, many rehabilitation units have been devoted to the hospitalization of patients with the COVID problems. Then we have to find new strategy for rehabilitation, to implement also remote rehabilitation with new tools to support the need of patients with the stroke, with the cognitive and the motor problem. We are in a good period of development of new tools, and we have to choose this tool for rehabilitation at home.
And I would, from that, lead on to Liam, because you made a very interesting presentation about how you had transformed your services into this, I like the word blended services, being at home, using telerehabilitation, taking the best out of two worlds. Do you think that is the future, and how can we do it in a good way?
Yes.
I do think it is the future. I mean, I think that it will have to be a little bit individual and bespoke. So some people kind of can use tele-rehab very well, and some people are hugely enthusiastic believers in it. Other people who might not be as technically literate or as IT literate struggle with it and value the individual face time. So I think having those three strands for us of a combination of tele-rehab, domiciliary visits, and kind of attendance at an outpatient clinic on a regular basis works, but each individual patient might find kind of various different levels of that work for them. So it has to be kind of responsive to the patient's needs and the patient's individual circumstances, rather than being one kind of blanket model whereby everyone gets a little bit of all three. Again, I come back to, I do think there probably needs to be, as Juliet said, if not an evidence base, some real quality measures to make sure that, you know, tele-rehab works and is as effective as kind of the current models that we are much more familiar with. I think I would be much more reassured if we had that data that we could then amend our systems and kind of services more permanently going forward.
I have to question one thing that you said. Does it have to be as effective? Because if 1 out of 4 will have a stroke in their lifetime, will there be enough staff around to give everyone the best? Or do we need a blend of quite reasonable, quite good, cheap, but not the very haute couture rehab?
Yeah, I possibly, and one needs to bear that in mind, but I do think one needs to have some measure that it is effective, and how effective it is, you know, might vary, and what levels of effectiveness we tolerate, given the obvious benefits to it, might vary. But I think it's incumbent on us all to make sure that we are doing the right thing by our patients. It's one thing for them to be content with it and to like it, but I think we need to make sure that it actually works. And
I've been thinking, I mean, we have Jörg here who has had difficulty speaking. We heard Alexia. It was a fantastic talk with lots of positive things. And my experience is that when it comes to aphasia, there is not usually not enough people with aphasia on the same level that needs to be treatment. And I can see that tele-rehab would be a way of perhaps creating groups. What do you say, Katarina?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, I think it is very important, this strategy for rehabilitation. The tele-rehab and there's also smart solution are very helpful for rehabilitation of cognitive function, and in particular for aphasia, because we can to set the exercise to the need of patients, and we can to prescribe a number of exercise as we want. The aspect very important is to set up the exercise on the possible recovery of patients over time. And then we adapted the exercise for all the improvement of patients. I think that tele-rehab and smart solution are very helpful for the rehabilitation of cognitive function, in particular for language problems. We have a lot of number of exercise on this.
There is one question for all of you. Do you think that the stroke and the pandemic has hit equal to all patients with stroke in Europe, or has there been a difference in people with minorities, language, not speaking the native language of the country, or what is your experience? Has this increased equality or has it increased inequality?
No, it is equality, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there were serious inequalities in stroke before the pandemic. I think the pandemic has just highlighted them, and for some groups made it worse. I mean, we know stroke is more prevalent in socio-economically deprived communities, in some Black and minority ethnic communities. Unfortunately, those communities have also been the hardest hit by COVID-19. I think there is no doubt that the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities, but I think in stroke there are also huge inequalities in access to life after stroke services. It's very patchy, and we really need policymakers and decision makers to recognise the importance of investing in life after stroke. More people are surviving their stroke thanks to the advances in medical treatment. It's just, hospital stroke treatment is transformed over the last 30 years, but we haven't seen the same transformation in the post-acute pathway, and we need to keep banging the drum that investment is needed to support people to live a good life, not just to survive.
So with those encouraging words, we need to wrap up this session. We want everyone to live a good life after this webinar, after their stroke, and forever. Jörg, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Katarina. I would like to close this event by thanking everyone involved, speakers, chairs, sponsors, SAFE, and of course you, the participants. Having suffered a severe stroke myself, I know at first hand the difficulties people face when putting their lives together again after a stroke. I'm delighted to see that this issue of life after stroke is at last receiving the European focus it deserves. And I hope that this will really change practice and see improvements in care. Finally, I'm very pleased to let you know about our next webinar. It will take place on Thursday, the 20th of May, and it will focus on sex, intimacy after a stroke. We will be in touch soon. See you at the next event. Thank you again, and goodbye.